worse financial situation. I've got to wait another couple of years before I get the tax-free benefit when I hit 60.
Okay, you've got our money. We don't want to put it in high risk. We want to know that it's there when time comes for us to retire, and just play it along so that we were getting a return that wasn't over the top, but it was just mediocre, and the money was still there when it came time for us to retire.
At the moment, our future for the next 30 years is looking good, as long as we stick within we know our confines of what we can do and what we can't do financially, but we can live a comfortable life.
I've been with a well-known superannuation company for many years, and I'm a bit disappointed that I've been with them that long, but when anything's changed, it was all right when things were going well. When things started to go down, they didn't seem to have any tactics to overcome that.
At one stage I was going to go down one path, and then I had a look at some figures and thought, no, hang on a minute, that's going to cost me a fair bit each year in charges. So I followed the advice of the other fellow I'd been seeing, who very generously said, well, if I were you, I wouldn't put all your money with us because we charge you too much. I would put your money with First State Super because their charges are much lower. If you put a little bit with us, I will give you the advice that you're going to need in an ongoing capacity, but it will cost you a lot less.
What members want is to be able to seamlessly move between work and retirement.
Longer term is demographics and the fact that the baby boomers are moving into retirement. So instead of being an industry that's focusing on accumulating assets, it's got to focus more on retirement income streams.
Look, there are existing default funds, but I think that what investors and members are going to be looking for going forward, and I'm talking 20 years out here, is actually a fully tailored asset allocation to them.
I think what we've got has served our members very well. I'm not convinced yet about life cycle strategies and actually changing people's strategy on an automatic basis throughout their lives, particularly approaching retirement, because we're actually trying to remind members that if they retire at 65, they've potentially got another 20 years to live and invest. So why are we panicking them before they get to 65?
We've sought the thoughts of our members extensively on this. We know that our members have an expectation that we're the experts in running their retirement savings. We understand them, we understand the industry they work in, we understand what they want from their super, and they have an expectation that we'll set up a fund for them that meets their needs, and that's what we do.
Unfortunately, Jeremy, I think you're 18 years too late. So the Universal Default Fund, yep, absolutely great idea in 1991 when we had compulsory super coming in 1992. You can't turn around and change all the goalposts 18 years later.
I think the major problem facing the industry is how do we ensure that members have an adequate income throughout retirement. And there's a whole range of things that we need to do to ensure an adequate income throughout retirement. There's a big focus on investment returns, on what the asset mix will be, on what the fees and charges will be, on administrative efficiency and industry structure, etc. There's also an increasing focus on what happens when you get to retirement, how the money that has been accumulated is spent, managing longevity risk, thinking about health issues, thinking about sort of product design, and again, the new regulations. But perhaps even more important than investment issues and spending issues is the saving that people do throughout their working lives. That is probably the most important thing to ensure an adequate income in retirement. And the saving that members do is a function, or it's influenced by a number of different factors. First, by government policy, obviously with the mandated superannuation contribution level of 9%. Many members will have much more because of that 9% than they would have had if it hadn't been there or if it had been at a lower level. And if we do go to 12 or to 15, many people will have a lot more than they would have had elsewhere, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. The second is obviously education and advice, and the fact is in our industry a lot of people only come to advice relatively late, and they are approaching retirement, and at that stage it's actually quite difficult to actually save an extra amount of money. And the third is what funds can do for their members to help them save along the way, and hence the topic here, designing a default contribution plan for members. So what I'm going to do is talk around the following 5 topics very briefly, and then come up with some conclusions at the end. The last one, behavioural factors, is really, having given you a little bit of the theory and given you some of the statistics that lie behind it, how can funds actually sort of change the behaviour of their members? To start with a little bit of theory, I think it's important to understand the sort of the basis on which I'm making these recommendations, because if the theory is wrong, the conclusions and the recommendations are wrong. And quite often people start with a theory, they'll then put it into a simple model, and the model depends upon a series of underlying assumptions. And so it's important to sort of lay these out at the beginning. I'm talking about really life cycle theory. Life cycle theory was developed first by 2 economists, Modigliani and Bloomberg, in the 1950s, and it's led to a whole literature. It's actually quite a different sort of theory to target date investing. Target date investing is an aspect of life cycle hypothesis, and that really says that you should change your asset mix depending upon the investment horizon. But life cycle theory is really, how do you spread your income over your working life, over your entire life, to achieve the highest level of smooth consumption in broad sense. And over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we are spending longer and longer in retirement. One way to think about this is to basically think of a seesaw which is placed in water. And the actual level of the seesaw, or the fulcrum, is above the waterline. But a seesaw can be up where one part of it is well above the waterline and the other is underneath, or the other side could be up and the first level down. And essentially, this life cycle theory says you are the person on both sides of that seesaw. On the one side, it's you in your working life, and the other side, it's you in your retirement life. And you don't want to live too well in terms of spending while your income is high, only to be underwater in retirement. But equally, you don't want to live too well in retirement and actually have a poor working life or be underwater in your working life. And so really it's about optimizing lifetime consumption, and I've written there that it's a very different thing to maximizing retirement income, because maximizing retirement income says if we increase contributions, we'll have more, but that's not really the point. The point is basically to balance both. It's not really about smoothing consumption over your whole life, because once you do retire, you have leisure. Leisure is valuable. You've got more flexibility to do things. So in fact, I think you can have a lower income in retirement or lower spending in retirement and still have the same sort of pleasure from life. And the last comment is something which is important there. I've got there 3 sources of funds. There's the member contributions, there's the employer contributions, and then there's what taxpayers in the tax and transfer system provide. But I've said really that there's only 2 sources of funds, members and taxpayers. And that's a sort of a philosophical idea, that if we increase employer contributions, ultimately it's the employee who will pay for it. So when we are talking about going from 9 to 12, it's not as if the extra 3 comes from nowhere. It's a little bit like Don Russell said in the panel session. When it was designed, we had to make the choices of actually taking money out of people's pockets now, that 9%, for something that would benefit them in the future. So it doesn't come from nowhere. This idea is that I'm going to use a theory and then I'm going to use a very simple model. And the model is a simple spreadsheet model, and it's the type of thing that people could program up themselves pretty easily. It's very much the kind of thing that Michael Rice and Rice Warner have done for EFSA in terms of the savings gap, etc. And it really says, let's put together a toy world or a description of a toy world, something that we can understand, because the real world is too complex. And the issue is, have we got the right things in there? So people who disagree with the conclusions I come to, one of the ways to start is to basically say, well, you've assumed a theory which doesn't hold, or you've assumed assumptions and starting points which are not valid. And I think as we go forward and we do research, we will get a better idea as to what those starting points are. The key assumptions I'm going to make is really the age of retirement, and I'm going to give a series of scenarios, starting with retiring at 67, but then in the other scenarios moving back to retiring at something like 62, and show you the impact on that. There's also an assumption that you need to make about the period in retirement. I'm not going from the age you retire until life expectancy, because something like 50% of people live beyond life expectancy. So I'm going to go through to, have you got enough money to last you to 95? Now at 95, about 75% of retirees at 65 will die before they're 95. Slightly more men will die than women, but that gives us some sort of idea as to the kind of period that we want to plan for. We need to think about the target retirement income, and I'm going to start with some simple target retirement income, but having an adequate amount in retirement is partly about setting expectations correctly, and so that's one of the variables we can change. Whenever you start and you look forward 30, 40, 50, 60 years, you've got to make assumptions about what the world is going to look like over that period. So I'm going to assume that the tax system we've got at the moment, the tax thresholds we've got at the moment, the age pension, the means test, the way those thresholds work, etc., remain in place over the next 60 or 70 years. And they are all adjusted for inflation and real wage increases. In other words, they all go up by the basic standard of living of average weekly earnings. And again, that may not be true. I'm going to think about investment returns, and particularly I'm going to talk a little bit about working income patterns. And it turns out that for savings patterns, working income patterns are pretty critical to the results I come up with. So just to give you an idea of the working income growth patterns, the first thing is that on average, people's standard of living and their real wages have been going up through productivity. So as an economy achieves productivity gains, those gains are shared between shareholders and workers. And the average real wage increase in the Australian community for the last 20, 25 years has been about 1% per year. And we've seen that in minimum wages, we've seen that in the age pension, we've seen that in sort of median incomes, etc. And so I'm going to assume that productivity increases will continue to work over this period going forward. The second trend is that people enter the workforce and they have limited experience, and not only do they get the productivity increases, but they get promotional increases. And so the promotional increases are going to be quite quick, quite strong early on, and they'll extend for about 20 years, but they'll become weaker and weaker as time goes by. And those two things are quite often taken into account when we do these kind of projections. The third thing, which is not actually always taken into account, is that real incomes tend to peak about 5 or 10 years prior to retirement. And so your peak earnings will be around about 55. This is obviously going to vary for different people in different professions. But from the age of about 55 onwards, your income will then start to go down again. And it'll go down as you get out of risk responsibilities, as you move from full to part-time work, as you stop doing overtime, etc. And that becomes a pretty important thing to focus on. And obviously, as I say, it varies dramatically. So that's the sort of the income growth patterns. We haven't got a lot of empirical data on this. There is quite a lot of work being done by ANU, a person called Tim Higgins, in an ARC grant, I think with Rice Warner and an AMP. And they're looking at expenditure sort of patterns over ages. They're looking at income patterns of cohorts, etc. And the more we start to learn about this, the better we'll be able to adjust the prescriptions. Okay, so before I go into when do you need to put more money into retirement, into your retirement savings, the first thing might be to ask, when might the current level of SG of 9% be enough? And I've got there, the current level of 9% will be enough for people potentially who will retire at a mature age, who have limited time out of the workforce. In other words, they've got a long period in retirement. They have limited adverse investment conditions, and they have moderate levels of income. Moderate levels of income are important because a key sort of structural component of the system is the age pension. And if you have sort of median income or average income, the age pension plays an important role. If you have twice or 3 times average income, then the age pension doesn't play an important role. Actually, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide just to make a point that this sort of pattern is the typical pattern of people who don't get out of the workforce. Obviously, if you get out of the workforce at an earlier point, you miss out on some of the promotional increases. And in fact, Tim Higgins' work shows that for women, it's a much flatter sort of level, because typically a lot of women on average are getting out of the workforce for having children, etc. And so we've got very different problems for men and women. So the base case, and this is the simple model, is really someone who starts working at 25, wants to retire at 67, and wants to have sufficient money to live until they're 95. Their current level of income is $45,000. $45,000 is approximately median level of earnings in Australia, sort of 75% of male or of average ordinary time earnings. There's a hump-shaped real wage pattern peaking at age 55, and so this person's income in real terms, and everything I'm going to do is in real terms, inflation adjusted, is at about 92%. At that point, they'll be earning about 114% of average earnings. And then it starts to decline on the other side. So when they retire, they'll retire on 65, which is again around about median earnings. So the income rises from median to above average and then to median again. There's no voluntary contributions. Investment returns after fees and taxes are 3.5% real, so 3.5% above the rate of inflation. And there's no risk in these sort of simple models. You can obviously build those in. And the other thing I've got there is that there's other expenditure other than spending on yourself or saving for retirement. And these are things like saving for precautionary, building up precautionary savings in case you're out of the workforce or whatever, saving for a deposit, buying a home, paying off the mortgage, buying consumer durables, educating your children, and spending on dependents, etc. And that's going to be about 10% of gross income. And you want to retire in about 65% of your final income. Your final income is $65,000, so you want to retire in about $40,000. Now, there's a series of pictures, and that's why I'll be able to go through this, quite quickly, because they're the same sort of things repeated. But essentially, what you have here is a graph which shows on the y-axis dollars. On the x-axis is age, going from 25 to 95. And you can see the first part of it is basically the income that the person has before they retire. And the purple is their permanent income. That's $45,000 for every year that they work, the 42 years. And the blue is basically the rest of their working life income. So obviously, the sum of those two is their income, and you can see it has that hump-shaped pattern. They build up savings, and then in retirement, they use some of their own money, which is the yellow, to fund a retirement income, and some of the age pension, because they get access to the age pension. If you put the real savings, you can see that this kind of person would build up about $500,000 or a little bit above. They would run that down in retirement, and they would still have enough money if they didn't have any other problems at around about 95. And you can think about the real consumption. So what I'm assuming is that after you retire, the amount of money that you have which comes to you is not subject to any savings or spending on dependents other than yourself, etc., and not subject to taxes. Prior to retirement, the amount that you can spend on yourself depends upon how much you earn, less how much you contribute to super, less the amount of tax that you have to pay, and then spending money on these other costs, etc. So you look at the 25-year-old, if they earn $45,000 and they're saving 9%, they will make a contribution to super, pay tax, spend another $4,500 in building up a deposit or whatever, and they're left with about $30,000 to spend. And so that's the typical problem. So you can see that this kind of person, SG alone would be enough. Now, as I say, the decline in income towards the end is what a lot of people don't model. And if that doesn't occur, and you'll see in one of my scenarios later, then 9% is not going to be enough. And so it depends upon the assumptions that you put in that drive the answers. So I'm going to look at typical members in your funds that have average income. They start at median income, they go above average, and then they go down below, but they want to retire earlier than 67. Or some of your higher income members who actually maybe have higher than average income. What about them? Or members who don't have that pre-retirement decline in income. What about them? And finally, people who actually need to spend different amounts of money during their working life. So those are the four scenarios. As I say, I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. So what I've done here is in red is the only thing that changes from the base case. So everything is exactly the same. You're starting at median income, you're earning 3.5%, you're spending 10% of your gross income on non-consumption expenditure, your income rises and falls, etc., in exactly the same fashion. The problem is that if you retire at 62, it doesn't have time to fall all the way. So you will actually retire on about 79,000, 93% of average earnings. So retiring earlier means that you spend less time working and more time in retirement. It also means that when you retire, you've got a higher income, which sets your retirement expectations higher. Those are the only changes, just retiring earlier. Just a comment on retirement ages, there is a ABS release, which I've referenced at the bottom there, called Retirement Intentions, which came out in December last year. And basically it looked at 7.3 million, and it was a sample from that, Australians who are over 45. And it gave various statistics. Of the 3 million people that were already retired, the average age of the people who already retired was 53. The average age at when they retired was 53. But there's a survivorship bias. The people who retired at 65 20 years ago may now be dead. The people who retired at 45 20 years ago are now only 65. So that 53 is not a good number. The average age of people who've retired in the last 5 years is about 60. The average age of people who retire sort of voluntary, so these are not people who've been made redundant or have retired for injury or whatever reason, etc., is about 62. And the average intended age of retirement is about 63. So it is moving up, and it is higher than about 60. So what I've assumed is 62. So case one, if you look, and I'm not going to show you all three graphs, I'm just going to show you the consumption. Case one shows you that your average consumption in your working life is exactly the same as before. It doesn't go quite as far because you're retiring earlier. And the amount of money that you've accumulated will allow you to fund yourself until about the age of 73. And so you will run out of money and rely totally on the age pension until 95. Now, one of the things is because you're retiring earlier where your income is higher and you want to spend about 65% of that in retirement, you can see it's a much higher rate. So what I've said is that instead of actually targeting a percentage of your final income, target a percentage of your final spending. In other words, this is this consumption smoothing, or the idea that in retirement you'll be able to spend slightly less and still have the same sort of lifestyle. So if you target 85% of pre-retirement consumption, it ends up being quite a small number in terms of final income, 52%, but I think it's much more realistic. Even by adjusting expectations, you're still going to run out of money. And so you can go through and you can say, how much do the extra contributions need to be to fully fund it, just run out of money at 95, and it turns out you need to make about 4% voluntary contributions. In other words, the 9% should be about 13% for people with this kind of profile. What about that same situation, someone who wants to retire at 62? Everything else is exactly the same. We're going to work off 85% of pre-retirement consumption. The only thing is that they have higher current income at the moment. In other words, these are your higher income members. A higher income member basically starts earning 125% of average earnings, rises to a peak of about 189% of average income, and then retires on about 130,000, which is about 150% of average income. Pretty much the same sort of fashion, even targeting 85% of final consumption, you're going to run out of money around about 77. But now, when you run out of money, you've got a very big gap to fill, because having earned a lot more money and having retired on about 130,000, given your spending there, to fall off your own savings and go down to the age pension is a very big gap. And so the issue is, how much does this person need to save? Well, for this person, they need to save something like about 5.6% in addition to the SG. So you can see that higher income people need to save more because their reliance and their access to the age pension is lower. And so the amount of voluntary contributions for people who have median level income is going to be different for people with average level of income and different again for people with high level of income. But taking into account the hump-shaped, it's important to sort of do this for all the different wage levels. Case three is, what happens if your income doesn't decline as you approach to retirement? And so again, in that retirement income and retirement intentions study, they looked at something like about 3 million people who were in full-time work who hadn't yet retired, and they asked them about their retirement expectations. About 30% said that they didn't really know how and when they would retire. But of the people who had thought about retirement, about 33% again said they would work full-time until they retired. So they'd work flat out and then suddenly stop. And the other 30 or 35% basically said they would move from full-time to part-time work. In other words, they would get very much that sort of pattern there. So there is a reasonable number of people who won't have that declining pattern. They'll work flat out until they think they've got enough money, and then they will stop. What about your members that are in that category? So what I've done here is I've gone back to the first scenario. This is someone who starts at age 25 earning median income. It rises to above average income and then falls to below average income again. And again, we've got no voluntary contributions, etc. You can see here now that the spending while you're working continues to go up, because essentially what you're spending on yourself is your income less your contributions to super, less your tax, and then less what you spend on these other costs. And so it continues to rise. This kind of person would retire on 97,000, and so the expectations in retirement are much higher. Also, when you retire before age 67, and what I've done here is assume that the age pension kicks in at 67, which it's designed to, but not yet, you can see you use up your own money pretty quickly. So those first 5 years of retirement are pretty expensive. And so you can see again that what you need to do is you need to trim this income in working age to build up in retirement. In this case, you need to make about 7% voluntary contributions. And so instead of actually saving 9%, you need to make about 16%. But you can see that if you did make contributions of 16%, you can see that you are funding a retirement which is higher than your level of spending until you reach the age of about 45. So as we keep increasing contributions for the young people aged 25, 35, etc., we are building up retirement adequacy, but we're condemning them to live at below their retirement lifestyle for much of their working lives. So the last case, which actually is going to reinforce this, is to say, well, what happens if your other expenditures are also hump-shaped and they also change with age? So everything is the same again. You're going back to the median income at age 25. You want to retire at 62. You want to live to 95. Real income peaks and then goes down, etc. But I'm now going to introduce hump-shaped, I'll just look at the time, hump-shaped spending on other things. So what are these other things? Well, basically in your 20s, you need to build up some precautionary savings. So you don't immediately start work at 25 and start saving for retirement when you're 70. You need to build up some savings so that if you're sick, if you lose your job or various other things, you have that. And you have to start thinking about building up a home deposit. Home ownership costs, I've assumed, come in more in the ages of sort of 30 to 44 and then start to tail off. But certainly when you first get into home ownership, you're struggling to make the deposit, then you're struggling to pay stamp duty and then furnish the home, etc., and then pay down the mortgage. And then, in age 35 to 44, on average, you're starting to spend on dependents, and that also starts to tail off. So again, you have that sort of pattern. What happens to your consumption during your working life if you add this in? And this is probably slightly unrealistic. I've just sort of made up these figures to something that I think is reasonable, but the kind of research studies that are being done which says how do people spend at different ages is something that I think we need to do. But you can see here that you're going to run out of money in your sort of late 70s. You're going to have to save more while you're working, but you can see already that you are living at below your retirement expectations until the ages of 45. So in my view, it makes sense to basically increase contributions, but not immediately from the age of 25. So you make voluntary contributions of 5% once you hit 45, going up to 9% when you're on 55. So your contribution level is really 9% in the early years when your income is lower. As your income goes up, your expenditure starts to go up. You still can't afford to put in too much more. You're buying a home and doing these other things. But eventually you start to have more discretionary income. You put money into super. And most people in their 50s, I think, should be putting 20% or above into super. So 2 last comments. One is a comment on behavioural factors. Even if you believe this and you want to try and help the members go into these sort of savings patterns, it's incredibly hard to get people to move. And it's incredibly hard to get people to go from sort of 9% contributions to 15% if that change means that they'll be worse off immediately to make that decision. And so there's a book which I've referenced there called Nudge. It's a book by Thaler and Sunstein, who are 2 Chicago economists. And its subtitle is Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. And the example they give is they say that a friend of theirs runs cafeterias for schools in the Chicago area. And she was looking at the different patterns of consumption across the different schools. And then she started to sort of fiddle with basically the choice architecture. And what she found is that if you have the hot foods, followed by the desserts and sweets, followed by fruit, the amount of desserts and sweets that are taken goes up 25%. If you have the hot foods followed by fruit, followed by desserts and sweets, the amount of fruit taken goes up by about 25%, and the amount of sweets and desserts goes down. And so the things that I think funds can do is basically change the architecture, to sort of nudge people into making extra commitments. And there is this idea that people are much more likely to commit to something in the future and then continue to do it once they've made that commitment rather than making a commitment right now. The conclusions, I guess, is I think it's dangerous to define retirement targets using pre-retirement income, because it varies so much as to when people retire, what the income patterns are, what their income and taxes are. I think the majority of members will benefit from making voluntary contributions. 9% is not enough for the vast majority of people, and so they need to make voluntary contributions at some stage. And hump-shaped income and hump-shaped non-consumption expenditures, to me, says that we should be focusing our efforts in getting the contributions up later in life. You don't get the compounding benefits, but that's when people can afford to make these contributions. Thank you.